Greetings, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give us another 30 seconds or so before we get rolling, just to get everybody in from the waiting room. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just as a reminder to everyone, this meeting is being recorded, and we will post the recording on the ISMTE website after it is finished publishing. Another minute or so while we get a couple more people in from the waiting room. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our office hours with ISMTE. Happy New Year if I haven't talked to you already. My name is Donna Blake-Weems. I serve as ISMTE's Executive Director, and today's topic is improving the quality of peer review. We're super excited to have everyone here with us, and this is a great sized group. This is intended to be for dialogue. We want to have people have an opportunity to dialogue, but just a couple of notes before we start. We're going to keep all cameras and mics muted for participants while the presentation is going on. And then as soon as it's finished, we'll go ahead and change the settings so everyone can turn on their mics and cameras and participate in the discussion. We do really want to hear your comments and your feedback and your questions, so please feel free to do that when the time comes. Again, we will be recording this session. It will be made available on the ISMTE website. I am so excited to welcome Michael Willis as our host today. And Michael, I'm going to go ahead and just pass it over to you and take it away.
Sure, thank you very much for that introduction, Donna, and welcome everyone to this office hours. I see some names on the attendee list that are very familiar to me. It's great to be in touch with you again, and some very new people or people that I've not been in contact with before. So welcome and thank you very much for joining. I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping and other information. So thank you very much, first of all, to our sponsor, J&J Editorial. Appreciate their support for this. I have got no affiliations that could be perceived as posing potential conflict of interest, other than the fact that Wiley recently acquired J&J Editorial. I'm an employee of Wiley, just make that clear. So today's discussion is all about quality in peer review. And the idea of this office hour session is not for me to impart all my wisdom, such as it is or isn't, to you. It's to prime the pump, really, to initiate some discussion and to get you thinking and being creative and fostering and sharing ideas among yourselves, among all of us, about the topic in question, quality in peer review. And so I want to, as I say, prime the pump for that and give you some pointers to the things we might talk about, things we might discuss, areas that might trigger ideas in your own minds. So that's very much the approach that I'm taking, and I'll be talking for maybe 15 minutes or so, and then it's over to all of you to contribute to that discussion, and we'll wrap up at about 5 minutes before the hour. So 3 things then. Why care about quality, first of all? Why do we care about the whole question of quality in peer review? What does quality mean? How do we define quality when it comes to thinking about peer review? And then thirdly, how can we improve quality? And I think that gets very much to the nuts and bolts of the question. And I think in ISMTE, we are all about, aren't we, thinking about operationalizing the things that we want to convey and the good practice and so on in our journals. And so perhaps that's where the discussion will go, although I think it'll be interesting to think about the first 2 topics as well in discussion. So anyway, why should we care about the quality of peer review? Let's get stuck into this. I've put 5 reasons on the screen here. Maybe you've got other thoughts on this as well. So first of all, we want to help authors to make their research articles the best that they can be. We're in the business of helping authors improve their research, and good quality peer review contributes to that end. Then secondly, we want to improve the robustness and credibility of, if I can put it like this, scientific knowledge. So this is the bigger picture, really, for that first point. The better the articles that are peer reviewed, the better the overall corpus of scientific knowledge, because those individual components, the articles, are better for the quality of peer review. And then thirdly, authors want the best from their publishing experience. And as we move to an increasingly open access and open science world, The authors are very much the customer and wanting a good experience from publishing their articles. And so they will expect, and they're right to expect, that the quality of peer review that they get on their articles is the best that it can be. I think fourthly, good quality peer review does help differentiate journals from other forms of publishing. And we could think there of preprints, for example, of the sorts of commenting and community review, in inverted quotes, that you might get on preprint platforms or blogs or whatever it is, grey literature. So good quality peer review does help distinguish journals from those other forms of publishing in the broadest sense, putting science out into the public domain. And then the last point, good peer reviewers make better authors. I do think that the more critical a reviewer is of someone else's work, in the best sense of the word critical, the more self-critical they'll be about their own research. And that can only be a good thing. It's a virtuous cycle. Now, it is tricky to define quality when it comes to peer review. Federico Bianchi and colleagues from Italy published an article, I think this was last year or the year before, I should remember that actually, but it was about looking at the contribution of reviewers to the scientific enterprise. What role do reviewers have in improving science? And how can you assess or measure that contribution in some way? Now, what they didn't look at, and they deliberately didn't look at this, is about the quality of peer review and how you take into account the quality of peer review. And the reason they gave is that, as it says here, considering quality would require defining what quality in peer review actually is, which is a difficult task. Difficult because quality is quite a slippery concept. How do you measure quality in a very scientific way? It's difficult. And then peer review can also have multiple purposes for whoever's involved. And I'll come back to that, hold that thought, I'll come back to that in a moment. Glonti et al. Rather in BMJ Open a couple of years back, made a point about, they did a survey of editors, and they made the point that about editors' expectations of things like peer review. And you can see here, as I've highlighted in red, they had different expectations and the level of depth of peer review. So although they sort of understood what peer reviewers generally should be looking at, their expectations were actually quite varied about what sort of depth of peer review they were expecting from reviewers, and what sort of elements that they wanted peer reviewers to take into consideration. And interestingly, and hold this thought as well for a bit later, they said that authorship experience is key to high quality reviews, while formal training in peer reviewing is not. And I think perhaps you came to this this office hours session thinking about quality in peer review and thinking, well, perhaps we'll talk about training in peer review and what training peer reviewers might look like. And interestingly, Glonti and al found that, well, in their view, formal training in peer reviewing is not a key to high quality reviews. As I say, I'll come back to that in a moment because that's something that's picked up by others as well. So I mentioned that Bianchi and his colleagues in their paper, they were looking at, in terms of quality of peer review, they were saying that it can mean different things essentially to different people. I was pondering this, I was listening to a radio program at lunchtime today, pondering, it was all about fake reviews actually on Amazon and other websites. But it also made me think about when people leave reviews on websites like that, what information are they trying to convey to potential purchasers of the product? Because quality can mean different things to different people. How you view a gadget that you might buy on a website might be different from the way I view it. And you might be looking at certain elements of that gadget, certain characteristics that are important to you, but actually they're secondary to me. And again, there's a relativity about this as well. Your standards might be lower or higher than mine. So in that sense, assessing quality is really difficult to grasp. Here's an example of a quotation when it comes to peer review. So here's a, I just made this up, a peer review report that you get back. This article is poorly written and the research is unsound. Now, I wrote that deliberately as a very reductionistic review comment, if you like, about an article. It's minimal, it's concise, it's terse, and I think it conveys the point that the reviewer didn't like the article very much. Now, for an author, that would be next to useless. What does the author take from that if he gets that comment back? And the author has no way of understanding how to revise their article, how to improve their article, how to make it better. So in that sense, it's useless for the author, and that's a bad quality review, you could argue. Now, for the editor, okay, the comment doesn't really give the editor much to write back to the author about how the author can improve their article, but it is really useful for the editor, you could argue, in helping the editor get a sense of the quality of that article. And in that sense, the review is sort of helpful. So I suppose I'm thinking that review quality could be about making it helpful for the different people involved in the publishing process. And perhaps that's a dimension that we want to think about when we're thinking about quality and peer review. So there are two ways, I think, or at least two ways that I've thought about quality and peer review in this whole context. One is looking at the individual peer reviews. So you get your score sheet back from the reviewers, and you look at the comments, you look at the feedback that's come back on the article, and at that level, you start thinking about, is this a good quality peer review? Is it a bad quality peer review? Okay. There are a couple of ways in which people have tried to do this. So reviewer rating system within things like ScholarOne, Editorial Manager, eJournal Press, it's possible to rate the reviewer and to give some sort of score in a quasi statistical way. It's a bit crude, I think everyone would admit, but it gives an indication of the quality of the review in some way. And I think that, yeah, there are definite weaknesses around about the way that happens. But my point is not whether that's a good or bad way of doing it. It's just that this is one way of looking at the quality of peer review, looking at an individual score sheet that comes back. Much more methodical and more scientifically robust is the review quality instrument that Van Rooyen and colleagues published back in 1999. It's not been used very widely, admittedly, but it's trying to help editors to assess the quality of reviews, individual reviews on an article. And it does that, as I say, in a fairly scientific way. Now, a lot of this work originates in biomedicine, and I do wonder whether, so the work around things like the review quality instrument, I mean, I do wonder whether those sorts of things or that approach actually does transfer to other fields. Quality of review in maths, for example, might be very different from the way you look at quality in reviews in psychology. And I think if we're looking at quality and peer review, we need to take into account subject discipline variation as well. So it's another dimension. Okay, so how could we improve those individual peer reviews? Well, we could give guidance. We could help reviewers know and understand the sorts of feedback that the editor is expecting from them. We could provide guidelines, reviewer guidelines. We could tailor the score sheet, modify the score sheet to help guide the reviewer through the article, focusing on the different components, the abstract, methods, results, and so on, and to give some feedback on grammar, perhaps not grammar, but scientific robustness, novelty, you know, those sorts of characteristics of an article. So that's one way in which you could improve the quality of a peer review, in a sense of improving the level of feedback that you'd get back from the peer reviewer. And then at a more general level, rather than just focusing on how to provide a good quality review on an individual article, you could go slightly broader and look at the way you train your reviewers. David Moa from Ottawa and colleagues there published in 2017 an article in BMC Medicine about editor competences. The way I've heard David describe it is you wouldn't get into an aeroplane if you knew that the pilot had not been trained. You'd want to be sure that the pilot had all the competencies necessary to execute the flying of that plane in a safe way, in a reliable way. And he says, why not apply that also to editors? And you could say, well, why not also apply that to reviewers? I think that's something actually that David's been exploring. So what are those competencies for reviewers that you would want to help them be the best they can be in providing peer review? And of course, that can come about through things like online courses. And there's an increasing number of online courses. Different publishers, societies have been producing courses to help train reviewers. And they could also come through formal workshops. And I've quoted or I've cited there Sarah Schroeter from BMJ in 2004, who made the point actually that formal workshops don't really seem to be very effective. And that was a point also that I think it was Glonti and colleagues made as well, that formal training doesn't really seem to be very effective in improving the quality of peer review. So that's probably good news, because formal workshops for reviewers are actually hugely time intensive and costly to put on. And of course, they don't work in a pandemic. So online courses are definitely have got the edge, I think. I don't know of any research that's been done about the effectiveness of online training of reviewers. Perhaps if you do know some, you can share that in the discussion. So that's one way of looking at quality anyway. You're looking at the individual article feedback. The other way is to look at the whole process of peer review. And by process, I mean the end-to-end process, right from submission all the way through to that editorial decision stage. Now that's broader than the way that we understand peer review in the strict sense, but it does take into account all the different sorts of checks that go on a manuscript: screening checks, submission checks, the editorial review. If you're thinking of a journal that's rejecting, I don't know, 20–30% of articles without sending them to peer review, well, there's some level of scrutiny that goes on in that 20–30% that I think needs to be taken into consideration. And then you've got the peer review in the strict sense, where you're sending it off to external peer reviewers. So there are different ways of looking at this. How can we improve the peer review process in this sense? At Wiley, we did something called the Better Peer Review Project that we I've got the web address there. And what we did was look at the way in which peer review quality or standards have been described in the literature. We did a bit of a survey of managing editors and editors-in-chief as well. And we identified 5 dimensions in which you can look at the quality of an end-to-end editorial stroke peer review process. So you look at integrity, you look at ethics, fairness, usefulness, and timeliness. And we found those as very useful headings to be able to categorize how we can improve the quality of the process, which means the feedback to authors, the usefulness to editors, and those sorts of things. And we came up with a 50-odd question survey that journals can do to see how they can improve their processes. What we also found was that in doing this, and maybe this won't be a surprise to some of you, but journals can be very inconsistent in the way that they describe their processes compared with how they actually implement those processes. It's that there is a gap there often. Not a surprise, because there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on, as you're keenly aware, in running a journal editorial office. Policies change, processes change, and it's really hard to keep all the different pieces of the puzzle. This is going to sound like a rubbish metaphor, but how do you keep all those different parts of the puzzle aligned and in step? Sorry for mixing my metaphors there. But there is a need for there to be consistency, because I think that does improve the quality of the process. And coupled with that is the whole question of transparency. It's important that journals are transparent about the way that they do their peer review and their editorial processes. The STM/NISO peer review terminology initiative, which kicked off a year and a half ago, I think, as I say, it was kicked off by the STM Association. It's now been taken on by NISO under NISO's wing to advance it. This is a terminology, it was formerly called a taxonomy, but it's a way of helping journals describe their peer review processes with different dimensions. For example, do you share the reviews between the reviewers? Do you publish the reviews? Is it a single anonymized or double anonymized process? Who is responsible for selecting reviewers? Those sorts of things. And the more transparent journals can be about their processes, the better. I just want to conclude before I move on to the kicking off the discussion section with one way in which I think we can help our review processes be the best they can be. Diversity in the whole peer review process. Last year's peer review week was about identity in peer review, and one of the takeaways from that, I think, is that the need to have a diverse peer review process and to take into consideration things like underrepresented communities in your peer review panels. This article by Clark and Jagsy in the EASE newsletter, European Science Editing, that came out just last year, talks about journals needing to intentionally cultivate and appropriately reward peer reviewers so that it includes meaningful representation from individuals and leading to rigorous scientific study and ensuring vitality and diversity of future leaders in the field. The better a peer review process is, or sorry, the better the representation of peer reviewers, the better the peer review process will be. It's vital that the makeup of your peer review panel isn't just your old mates that you've been with for the last 20 years. I'm stereotyping terribly there, but what's really important is that the different voices that need to be heard in assessing science and any scientific or scholarly research are heard, and that can only improve the quality of the peer review process. So I'll be quiet now. Generally, I'll help facilitate discussion and so on, but I want to hear your voices on this and what you have to say. And I've got 4 topics here that might help you think about how we can lead discussion. So what does quality of peer review mean to you? Maybe you've got your own thoughts on this already, and they may coincide or they may completely be at odds with what I've just talked about. Share those. What other factors come into play when you're thinking about quality of peer review? I've given some ideas, perhaps there are other things that you've got in mind. And then what specific measurable strategies have you tried to improve the quality of peer review? Something I haven't talked about is incentives and recognition. Maybe that's a direction you want to go in, and how that might improve quality. But I'd love to hear, and I think everyone would like to hear from each other, the specific strategies that might be in place. And then how could ISMTE support you in improving the quality of peer review? What can the society do? Is there a role for the society in helping in this area? Okay, that's what I wanted to mention. I'll have a look through the chat, but Donna, do you want to sort of do the housekeeping on how this works?
Sure, absolutely, Michael. Thank you. So I've gone ahead and I've unmuted everyone. We do have a couple things in the chat that have come up. Specifically, Mario has asked, can you tell us in regards to the better peer review, are you evaluating how submitted to published articles change in these domains?
Sorry, I have to, are you evaluating how submitted to published articles change in these domains? Okay, yeah. So we didn't, Mario, in that context. We weren't evaluating the improvement in quality of the article. We were looking at the different ways in which the process that you apply to those articles works. So we looked at things like guidelines. We looked at submission checks. We looked at the ways in which reviewers disclose conflicts, that sort of thing. So we weren't looking at we weren't evaluating the quality of the finished article, is it, or not the quality, that we weren't evaluating the impact of the review process on the development of that article, if I can put it like that. We were looking just at the different processes along the way. And yeah.
But as you, if you don't mind me asking, but as you did recommend these 5 metrics in a way that we could measure quality of peer review, then it seems that from what you suggest, this is an expected metric that should come out in how good a specific journal or an article is approved on these 5 stages. Because if you call this a better peer review, it means that we need to be able to prove that peer reviews in the past did not in the same rate improve these 5 items as the whatever initiative is done.
Yeah, I agree to an extent. I think you're right that you would, from a, if you're going to analyze peer review, then you would have to see some measurable outcome that you can then, you can quantify in that way. I think the way we looked at it was, it comes back to that, who is peer review for, and how do you assess the quality of the process in the sense of, how would you, for example, putting a question back to you, how would you assess whether peer review has been done ethically in terms of the way the article has been improved? Or how would you, as one example.
Well, you have a very clear list of the questions under ethics in the Better Peer Review website too, which means that the article has to have, for example, reported on the ethicals approval that it has or not. Because we've seen in many preprints and in many papers, then when they are submitted, they don't have this information, and then the journal forces them to add this information. So that means that doesn't matter was that directly peer review or the journal internal checks, but it means that from the submission to the publication, the ethics question has been addressed. The same as reporting guidelines questions. That's the way you assess it. You see from the things that has been submitted, is that a requirement in the checking box during submission to put it in? And has that thing been reviewed? Because what we're trying to do with, I think, any list, including this, is have things that our reviewers no longer need to do. Just for the other audience here, I'm an editor of a journal on peer review, and that's why this is very interesting to me. But we're trying to minimize the work that peer reviewers do. So if we are, as a publisher or as a journal, doing boxes that then reviewers don't need to do, then I can alert the reviewers, disregard anything but focus only on methodology. Yeah. So there are now initiatives in doing structured peer review across many publishers, where we are stepping away from saying, maybe don't even look at the introduction. I don't care. Please only assess the methods or the results. And I, as an editor or someone else, will look at the, do they cite what they need or something else? Because a lot of what we've seen by reading review reports is that a lot of reviewers comment on, reference has been wrongly typed, or, you have spelling errors and things like that. If those kind of work is removed from the reviewers, then they can focus on the actual science of the paper. And I think that's where we can show what the peer review does. So the other thing that I also asked you, on your link, you say you have a self-assessment tool, but it doesn't work. So please, could you see that?
I'll do that, yeah. Mario, you've done some work, am I right in remembering this, that you've done some work on looking at the way in which preprints have changed in publication output. Do you want to talk about that? Because I think that would be interesting to people as well.
Yes, and we did, and something that maybe you can also update in your slide. There was a systematic review on all the quality assessments tools. You mentioned here one of them, but there's a review of more than 36 tools that are trying to define quality of peer review. And we have done first a review of around 20 tools that are trying to assess changes between a submitted and a published manuscript, or between a preprint and a published manuscript. And these goes, for example, are very descriptive. Have there been any changes to objectives or p-values or conclusions or things like that? So one of the things that our study did is we looked at all sections of the paper, including from authorship to number of references, and to the number of tables, to sort of anything that you can find in the article. The question is, most of the research on this has found that the majority of changes happen in introduction and discussions, which are what I call cosmetic changes. They improve the readability, they improve the nice flow of the text. But if the change does not happen in the methods or in the way the things were analyzed or in the main conclusions, then we are not adding actual value to that article except making it more readable to the audience. I'm not saying that that is not a very important contribution, but it means that a lot of research saying, and one that has been published by other groups said that 15% of conclusions go through major changes. For COVID-19 articles, it was a study published last year that said that 15% of articles went through major changes in their conclusions, which is a big percentage, but it also means that 85% of articles don't go through those changes. It means that we may necessarily do not need peer review for 85% of the articles.
Yeah.
And that is something that I, as an editor of peer review journal, am very much interested to know. When do whatever and however we would define, apologies for the text in the back, however we would find major contributions or necessary or important contributions happen. Because if most changes happen to introduction, it means that researchers around the world are bad or lazy at doing proper literature searches. But those don't change the study that they've done, because we're changing things that do not impact the conclusions of the study. So I think it's very important that we as publishers or as journals can be able to say, what has our peer review actually done?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have we proven the quality stamp, this is a good quality study, and we have improved its readability? Or have we said when the study was submitted, it had methodological or analysis problems that we then solved? And this is the kind of research that I'm trying to do, to see what number of papers actually change in their methods or analyses from the submission to publication.
Yeah, thank you. You've really argued cogently for my point about the importance of this subject. So yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I think it's just about transparency, because we don't know. We don't know what we're doing. We have the system in place, similarly to ethical review boards. Often you see people working for ethical review boards, that 95% of the things that they get, they in the end approve, even more than that. So this is a hurdle that we need to go through, but it doesn't mean that it's the most effective way we're doing it.
Yeah.
And when you don't have structured questions of what reviewers are looking, it often doesn't mean that they're looking at the important stuff. Sorry, I don't want to take up time. There's a lot of other people.
It actually ties on to, moves on to Christie's comment about peer reviews needing training in assessing methodology. And I'm not sure, I can't see a link in there, Christy, but maybe that's forthcoming. Yeah, what are people's thoughts around this? Christy, do you want to expand on that? I see you've just turned your camera on, so I'm picking on you a little bit, but.
I was afraid you were going to pick on me. Here comes the link. I'm not sure I can speak intelligently to this, but it's because it's something I'm just learning about myself, just learning about the PCORI methodology standards. But I think I take Mario's point. I think that's something that I've been struggling with in improving peer review over the couple decades I've been working in this. How do we help peer reviewers in the assessment of the manuscripts that we send to them if they haven't previously received any training in their educational systems or from their mentors in how to do that? And methodology is not something you can just do quickly. It really requires some good training, and the PCORI materials I'm just starting to look at and get through, and so I can't talk about them specifically, but I hope they might be a resource for others.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question about the training. I cited 2 studies that said formal training doesn't really seem to be very effective. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on whether, okay, what's your experience with training, perhaps of peer reviewers, and whether actually you found it much more effective to do, as Mario suggested, where you have more structured peer review, you change the way your score sheet's structured so that you're guiding peer reviewers to provide the feedback that you want. That's something we've started doing at Wiley for our physical science journals. What are your experiences? Would anyone like to contribute?
I think we need to do all of those things. I think the structured reviews are also very important. The trouble with having the journals provide the training is it requires resources that a lot of journals don't have, and they've got to go to things provided by others with deeper pockets.
Mhm.
Kristen, I don't think that we need training for peer review. And this is maybe controversial opinion, and I often struggle with this. It's not that I don't want it. The question is, every PhD student or every researcher out there has a different kind of training. You don't pass one degree when you get your PhD or when you become a researcher. We know that most reviewers are researchers that have published, let's say, 9 or plus articles. I'm making up a number, but it's usually those who are a little bit more experienced that get invited. Doesn't mean that you won't get invited even as a junior researcher. But the question often comes is that we don't directly ask them what to review. When I often read review reports from other journals as part of our research, and you often see that they don't comment on important stuff because they're not asked. When you leave them an open text, they comment on only what they know. It is very tricky to answer a question. Do you believe that the statistics was appropriate in this paper? People will avoid answering that question unless you ask it directly. And unless you put them an option, I'm not capable of evaluating this. And when we know how many of our reviewers that invite will honestly say, I'm sorry, but this needs to be evaluated by someone else, then we will know have we asked the right reviewers. Because right now we presume when a reviewer hasn't commented on a specific aspect of a paper, that it means that that part of the paper is correct. That's not true. We don't know if that person even knew how to evaluate that aspect. And so unless you really ask them, has this been goodly done? Would you put your name publicly? That this part is something that you would also do, that you can replicate. They don't often comment. They skip those parts. It's the easiest to comment. I think you missed one thing in introduction, or I think you could maybe talk a little bit more in the discussion. But tell me, really, do you think that the analysis was appropriate for this study with the sentence, yes, I think it is appropriate, or no, I think it is not? And when you force the reviewers to say this, we come to the question, do they need training or not? Or do we need to find people who actually can do this? So why do we think they need training? Is it because we get bad reviews we haven't asked questions for, or because we haven't found the appropriate people to answer those questions? Because it's very different in grant peer review. Grant peer reviews are extremely structured. Of course, they come before the results are done, but grant peer review is so structured compared to the journal peer review. And I think we need to bring the journal peer review to that structured questions. If you would have a table 3 by 3 where all 3 people answered, was the objective clearly stated in the study, then it wouldn't be a problem for editor to know, does it need to be changed? Or any aspect like that. And I think this is where we need to go.
I completely agree with the structured format. I have no problem with that, but I think training is also needed. I think, especially if we want to include and encourage other, a more diverse reviewer pool, we've got to give people the opportunity to learn how to do it.
Or we just need to open it up. Instead of having a closed peer review, you can also post on Twitter or something. We're welcoming open peer review reports from anyone in the world, like this is a preprint. Here is a set of questions that we want you to answer. And then imagine, instead of having 3 answers to the questions where the objectives being clearly stated, having 20 or 30. You would then have a much bigger security on, do you think something was done in a proper way?
So here's, so there's, thanks for the comments and the discussion. I can see we've got some resources there Megan's pointed to for resources for supporting reviewers. And if you've got any examples of structured peer review questions to your own journals, feel free to put the information in the chat or speak now. It's a really interesting question about the training, isn't it? Let's move on to another topic which has come up in the chat, which is about, if I can find it, someone asked about finding reviewers. Where was it? How can the editorial office encourage reviewers to take training? Many times editors, this is Sri Lakshmi, thank you, Sri Lakshmi. Many times editors have had a hard time having reviewers to accept a review. What's the solution for this? I guess that ties into the question of quality in peer review, because you want the reviewers with the right level of expertise in the field or the right expertise and the right level of expertise to be able to review. You don't just want anybody to review, right? And so strategies for finding those people and strategies for encouraging them to accept the invitation to review are important. So that's another area we might discuss. Would anyone like to chime in with thoughts on any of that?
Hi, hi, Diana.
Hi, Diana. Hello.
Hi. Hello, nice to see you.
Yeah, long time no see.
Yes, and it's just I came to this discussion today because, as you know, I manage a number of Springer journals, and they have this strategy, exactly what we're talking about now, which is in order to find reviewers, they've got to deal with RSQ, with Research Square, and they actually invite. When you're inviting reviewers, the editors then have the chance to invite the reviewers from Research Square, and they receive a monetary payment, which is a very new concept to me because it's meant to be voluntary. Now, some of the reviews are very good, but some reviews are very bad, and I literally just notify that, you know, they're not acceptable. But I'm just wondering what you think about this, you know, from Wiley, from other publishers, because it's just a very new thing that started with Springer, at least that we're dealing with.
Payment for reviews, essentially.
Yeah, with a deal with RSQ.
Yeah. I think I'd love to hear what others think on this. I think the question for me in terms of this particular office hours is, can you tie that somehow to improving the quality of the peer review process? You wouldn't just give payment to somebody for turning in a very poor review, but then that begs the question, what is a good, bad review? And yeah, how do you deal with that? Who decides whether the payment is worth it or not? And is it actually, going back to Mario's question, actually, you know, does it actually improve the paper? So yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think that paying peer review is wonderful. We can afford it. The problem comes the same with grant peer review. You've seen it in many countries that it ends up being a bid for money. You know that it costs and you will earn specific amounts of money. And then it becomes sort of a nepotism practice where always the same people are being invited to review and always the same people are getting that money. We know right now from reports that a majority of reviews is done by a small percentage of publishing authors. And so if we will only be inviting the best, which is what you want maybe, but if you're only inviting the best expert to review and paying only him, you're not allowing opportunity for that money to be spent elsewhere. And we've seen that with statistical reviewers that some journals employ and other people. When you hire someone to do the work, are you hiring them full-time to then review every paper in your journal? For example, your editor, if you pay him, or will you have specific staff? So if we turn completely to reviewing, will you, for specific journals that can do it, that are not general journals, if, for example, if you're a very, topic-oriented journal, you could have a list of 10 or 12 people that are reading all the paper in them, because why not? They are now paid to do this work. And instead of getting a postdoc position, university position, or something like that, you could be paying people to full-time or a certain percentage of their time everyday review. We've seen from the Pablon database, which to me is always incredible, and I cannot believe that, but there are people who review from 300 to 1,000 paper per year. So it means that someone is most likely paying them to do this. And now I have nothing against this, but it means that it can be, a business. So who gets then selected to be paid? And then the question is, right now we, operate under this exception that you have a large pool of reviewers. Maybe every journal has 100 or 200 or 300. We often don't report those numbers, so you don't know. But when a journal becomes a system where every paper will be reviewed by 3 or 4 or 12 people, like you have, I don't know, Michael probably knows it, but it's an initiative which is called Crowd Peer Review, which is the chemistry journal of 120 agreed upon reviewers who will review every of those papers. So there's a pool of 120 that will review anything that comes in them, but only those 120. How do you include other people? How do you get on that list to be among them? So it's become an elitist society where journals with their pool of reviewers, get to decide who is going to be it. Unlike the public peer review, where people can post comments on PubPeer or somewhere else, when you can see the differences between those that are invited by the journal and those that are not. And I think we need pilots in this. People who self-select to review something through a public pool versus the one you invite. And if we have a tool to measure quality, including these 5 things that you recommend from Wiley, we could see, can a person who thinks that he's capable of evaluating it would be better than the one that is invited by a journal? I think this is a pilot that would be very interesting.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that there is a whole dimension, isn't there, about community peer review. I mean, so community review has taken off in quite a big way in preprint space, I think, lately, in particular areas of preprints. And again, the question, you keep coming back to this question, what do you mean by quality, and how do you assess quality, and what does that mean in how can you guarantee quality, as well as something we haven't really talked about, but ensuring that the quality is there, which you can only do once you define quality, I guess. Diana, I'm not sure that any of that really helps answer your question as such, unless anyone else has got any contributions to make about the whole question of incentives. I guess it doesn't have to just be monetary either. I mean, okay, Publons, for example, doesn't give you the same type of credit as getting, you know, $50, £50 or whatever in your bank account, but it's an incentive all the same. And maybe there are some similarities in the way those sorts of incentives work.
You have now incentives, and some people calling it universities, that unless you review as much as you publish, that you should not be promoted as a researcher, that you need to contribute a specific number of your hours to the community, so that it needs to be evaluated in your, you know, sort of hiring or promotion criteria, which is wonderful, again, as an initiative, but it comes to the question, how do we then ensure that every person out there, that every researcher has the opportunity to review? Because if it's your requirement to review, I don't know, on average, a researcher publishes 1 paper per year across the 8 million that we have. So that means that we need to ensure that all of those 8 million people have at least one opportunity to review for an official journal, and that is somewhere recorded or more. You have people that publish, you know, 60 papers per year. Does that mean that they need to also review 60 papers per year? Which often they don't. So, you know, there is always a misbalance of who does something and why. We don't even have data on how many editors of journals do independent reviews for all the articles a day.
Yeah, I remember we spoke at the AP Publishing Conference in Berlin a few years ago. We did a panel. This is some people in the peer E group. We spoke at a panel on peer review, looking at peer review generally, and the sorts of things that we've been talking about in the peer E consortium. And one of the questions from the floor was, why are you focusing on peer review? Shouldn't you be focusing on editors? You know, isn't this the tail wagging the dog, that sort of thing? And it does make me think we don't really give enough attention to the role of the editors in the whole peer review process, in terms of trying to understand what is it that editors want from the peer review process, and questions like how do they go about selecting reviewers, and the sorts of things you've been talking about, Mario, where the incentive to review is coming from your employer, your institution, in terms of tenure and getting promotion and so on. It really places the onus on the reviewer to get those opportunities to review. If they're not getting those opportunities to review, then they're not going to be, you know, how on earth do they progress? And so the reviewer has got somehow, or, you know, the academic has got somehow to be identifiable to the editor as a reviewer who's available to review. That's an enormous burden, in a sense, on the reviewer, I think, or the researcher. It does change the dynamics of the whole thing, I think.
It does, but there were initiatives. I know that Elsevier has a website where you can apply to be a reviewer for specific journals. You can submit your publication list or reasons why you think you should be a reviewer for some journals. Many other journals don't have this because you don't have resources enough to read through this or, you know, use them. But that's, you know, we come always to that same question, you know, who do we give these opportunities to? And I really hope to pilot and also see it, the journals, for those researchers who allow and who post a preprint, or during the submission of a paper allow that, you know, the journal posts a preprint. I really hope to see in the future pilots where we will both invite, you know, those close peer reviewers that we do, and open it to the public and give them a month to also fill out peer reviews, to see sort of the way the preprint is being done, you know, peer review for preprinting, but this time being done on a journal level. I think in my journal, we have around 15 or 20% of authors that agreed to post the submitted version to the Springer Nature's preprint server. So for those 15 to 20%, in theory, I could post on Twitter or somewhere would anyone from the public be willing to review this, filling out this form? And it will be considered as well as the 2 or 3 reviews that I do. And that's the pilot that we plan to run by the end of this year. Of course, with agreement with the authors, but that's where we want to see the community. One way of allowing community to nominate themselves as reviewers rather than we nominating them.
Yeah, and I see some questions in the chat or some comments around this. Priyanka, I like that, volunteers. Yeah, around helping reviewers to get, or researchers to get the opportunity to peer review. Every editor always wants more peer reviewers. You know that if you're an editor, and I know that from the publishing perspective, it's the #1 pain point for editors that we found in our surveys. And I think that's been exacerbated by the pandemic, as somebody commented in the chat. And yeah, finding the opportunity or creating the opportunities for reviewers to sign up to review and to volunteer for peer review. But also that's going to help the reviewers, those researchers, because it gives them extra experience, extra exposure. There are tons of reasons why it's good to peer review, and also it's helping the editors because it helps them to expand and diversify their reviewer pools outside of the people they would normally go to. I think for all of that, it's still important that we think about how do we ensure that there's that adequate level of quality, comes back to quality in peer review. And that's an interesting conundrum. Put your if you've got thoughts on any of this, feel free to open up, turn your camera on, or you don't have to turn your camera on, just unmute yourself and that's fine. Or put stuff in the chat.
How effective do you think, Michael, are we in desk screening? There was a talk before this on the effectiveness of preprints and on the effectiveness of COVID-19 articles. And it said that 75% of submitted COVID articles have been rejected. 75% across a wide range of publishers.
Rejected by peer review and publishing.
They did not share that information. So I don't know if it's the desk rejection or after peer review. It's probably a combination of both. But even so, it means, are we maybe just as journals, are we accepting too many papers to review? Is there a quota at journals? When they reach the monthly submissions, do they say, I'm sorry, we reached this monthly submission, we were not able to on adequately time process your paper? Is that ever done? Does anyone admit that they won't be able to handle it? Or is it always because of the money or APC cost or something that we will accept as much as we get, and maybe then the quality suffers?
It needs unpicking that data, doesn't it? Yeah. Priyanka says, I've worked on a pilot for desk rejection, impressive results, a lot of precious time was saved. Yeah.
I know that one thing as an editor that I've done, but we are again a very small journal because the studies on peer review are very, a small number of them get published per year. But I've started fully peer reviewing articles and sending that review before I even invite reviewers, because I've often seen that the amount of things that I can detect for a very specific journals is sometimes larger than what my peer reviewers do, because I have a greater investment in it. And then that desk rejection or that comments save the times of my reviewers having to comment on the same things. And I don't think we often talk about this. How often is it that the comments that the editor says on a specific topic are not the same ones that the reviewers do? Why wait for the reviewers to say something that you've detected in a paper?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to my point about what we were doing with Wiley was looking at the whole process. So it does include things like the submission checks, because I think that's wherever that happens in the process, it's got to happen somewhere. So whether you're looking, whether it's the reviewer who you'd expect to pick up on ethical issues, I don't think we should put that burden on reviewers necessarily, but those are things that have to happen in terms of assessing an article. So that can get done in the editorial office with automated checks or manual checks. The editor's comments have to go into that process because they shape the outcome of an article. When you submit an article and you get feedback, you get the editor's feedback, hopefully, as well as the reviewers. And yeah, it's the whole end-to-end process, isn't it?
I very much agree. I would really like to see, these list of pre-submission checks that we are trying to develop with artificial intelligence or manual screening, that we're taking away the work from reviewers.
Yeah, and to that point, the STM NISO peer review terminology initiative is starting to look at how we can, I'm on the working group, is starting to look at how we can do that at an article level, so that when an article is published, it will talk about the, or it will display on the article the sorts of checks that it's gone through. Has it gone through authenticate screening? Has it had some image checking? Have COIs and ethical, conflict of interest and patient confidentiality statements and things, have they all been published? Sorry, not published, have they been checked? Is there any other AI that might have been used on the article for integrity checks, like checking the statistic methodology or whatever it might be? So look out for that, because that will that should be forthcoming, or there'll be more information on that this year. We are at 5:02, and I did promise that we would sort of wrap up around now. I will, for one last minute, would anyone like to make a closing comment or throw out a random, comment or question on the topic as a sort of takeaway? I think it's been really helpful for me to think through some of these issues. Thanks for the feedback. I have been keeping an eye on the chat, and I'm sorry if I haven't picked up on all of it, but I hope it's been helpful for everyone to see the sorts of topics and things that have been coming up there. Yeah, and I hope it's been helpful for you to think through the whole question of quality and peer review. It's not an open and shut thing by any means. There are lots of different dimensions and avenues. Keep an eye on what's going on in research and peer review, because there is a lot, increasingly a lot of work going on in what peer review is and how you define quality and peer review. So with that, I will close. Donna, can I hand back to you? Is there anything you'd like to say by way of wrap up?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call today. I specifically want to thank Michael for being the host for this discussion. I think this was a fantastic example of sort of collectively getting everyone together and sharing ideas. We will post the recording for this session on the ISMTE website, and we will send out a feedback survey for everybody. We would love to get your feedback on how this session went and any suggestions you have for changes. Wanted to go ahead and once again thank our sponsor, J&J Editorial. And then please be sure to check back to the ISMD events website. We do have another office hours coming up next week. I think this is going to be another great discussion. So hopefully you'll join us on January 20th. And that is, we'll go ahead and we'll pop that link into the chat so that you can get to the events list there as well. And then again, please feel free to reach out to ISMTE at any time. We're here to help. We're here to offer suggestions. And we do have a lot of resources on our website. So please feel free to reach out to us. So again, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for everyone. We'll see you soon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for me too. Thanks, Donna, for facilitating. Appreciate that.
Stay well, everyone.